Welcome to Understanding Oklahoma, a series of conversations looking at the richness but also the complexity of the histories and cultures that contribute to Oklahoma's distinctive identity. I am so excited about our guest today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. David Wrobel, Dean of the University of Oklahoma's College of Arts and Sciences and historian of the American West. Dr. Wrobel's research includes the Dust Bowl and the life experiences of Oklahomans who migrated to California during this time. Thank you so much, David, for spending this time with us.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
Could we start off with an overview of the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl? I think there are a lot of younger people who don't realize this was a really big deal.
Yeah. Okay. Well, the Depression, the magnitude of the Depression, I think is the first place to begin. So the scale is unfathomable. I mean, we see extreme poverty today. What we don't see is extreme poverty affecting as large a segment of the population as we saw throughout the decade of the 1930s. There was a single day in 1932 when a quarter of the entire state of Mississippi was foreclosed and auctioned off. So there are amazing statistics that show us the depth and the scale of the Depression, the impact on people. It's a wonderful book.
What are the years exactly?
So I think the Depression really begins in 1930, the stock market crash in the fall of 1929, but it's really by early 1930 that a full-blown economic depression is underway and probably reaches its most extreme point in the winter of 1933, right at the moment of transition from the Hoover administration to the Roosevelt administration. Things begin to improve under the first New Deal, which is underway as soon as FDR is in office, so early 1933. Things improve up until about 1937, when in an effort to try and restore some sort of economic stability by trimming back on indebtedness, FDR perhaps becomes a little bit too restrictive, and then we see the country drop into a recession that's often referred to as the Roosevelt recession in 37, 38.
Could I go back just a little bit, because I want to stay on this just a little bit longer, because I think young people who have known an affluent U.S. for so long might need a moment to just reflect on this. I mean, you're talking about a high suicide rate, people jumping off buildings, blowing their brains out. I mean, the entire country feeling as though it just kind of fallen off the edge of the earth. Just a terrible trauma.
Sure. So there are stories associated with the Wall Street crash and brokers committing suicide. I'll be frank, I think the most moving stories that we have of suicide are stories that are recounted in a wonderful book published in the 1960s by a scholar named Caroline Bird, and it's called The Invisible Scar, The Nation Confronts the Great Depression. And in that book, the author writes about folks who, had a strong sort of sense of independence and self-reliance and the thought of accepting support, which was such an unusual concept in America at the time, was so difficult for them that there were people who committed suicide because they couldn't imagine a life in which they were not supporting themselves. Some of those stories of people in despair, of fathers leaving their homes dressed in a suit, changing into a suit of rags to sell pencils or anything they could sell on street corners, not wanting their families to know that they were unemployed, not wishing to deal with the shame of that, not being able to. Those stories are just, they're disturbing. The scale of poverty is disturbing. The Depression carries on through the end of the 1930s. And right here in Oklahoma, we saw some of the very worst, most abject poverty in the country. It was described by one writer in 1941, a writer named Henry Hill Collins, said that what he saw at the May Avenue camps along the river in Oklahoma City was the worst poverty anywhere west of the Mississippi. So
all of this sort of sets up conditions for the Dust Bowl, basically, right?
Right. So the Dust Bowl is a hugely important phenomenon, and we don't want to make light of the incredible extent of the Dust Bowl, but we need to bear in mind that most people who leave Oklahoma leave because of drought and a collapsed economy. The Dust Bowl is a manifestation of that drought, an extreme manifestation, but it affects mostly the far western panhandle states of Oklahoma, the eastern states where novels like John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath begins, was not really affected by the Dust Bowl so much as by drought and by the collapse of the economy.
My family's from Oklahoma, but I've only lived in Oklahoma for my professional life when I came here after graduate school, and I've seen dust storms a few times. And once I saw Ken Burns' documentary on the Dust Bowl, I realized these weren't dust storms. They were the magnitude was much greater, where whole towns were in darkness for days, day after day. It seems like a descent into hell. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, I think the dust storms could be incredibly frightening. They were terrible for people's health because dust got in any crevice, any opening in a home. And people respiratory systems of human beings were incredibly adversely impacted. Wonderful descriptions by some of our own Oklahoma writers of this. I think one of the most powerful descriptions of the impact of the Dust Bowl on individual human lungs is our own Rilla Askew's novel Harp Song, which has a couple of scenes where dust storms are described, and the distinctiveness of Oklahoma dust storms with the red soil, and the sense that you could know where a dust storm was coming from, what state it was coming from, blowing in from, based on the color of the dirt in the air.
But you said that the extremes of the kind of thing that I've seen pictures of, where communities are just in darkness for days, that's primarily the western part of the state. In the eastern, they were dealing with depression, but probably not the extremes of the dust storms you're talking about.
I mean, certainly dust would have been blowing in the eastern part of the state. Dust ended up in the Atlantic Ocean that had come all the way from the plains. But, so it's hard to contain an environmental phenomenon like that. But the worst ravages of the Dust Bowl were really in the Panhandle states and the states around them.
We see in the Grapes of Wrath people migrating from Oklahoma to California. It's vivid in the movie. It's really detailed in the novel. Why were so many people? Why California? Why were they traveling to California?
Well, I mean, the biggest attraction, there's agricultural work to be had in other states. We see some people working as migrant laborers in parts of Arizona that were irrigated, but for the most part, it's that sort of garden of the world in California that has the most in the way of employment opportunities for migrant labor. And what we see is essentially the displacement by people coming in from the southern plains, from Oklahoma, but also Texas and Arkansas and Kansas, displacement of populations of color that had been working the fields in California previously. And now there's this increased competition for these incredibly valuable positions, labor jobs. I mean, there are moments in the Grapes of Wrath that are particularly moving, where one moment in particular where Marjode is sort of admonishing a family member who says, 20 days work, it's there waiting for us. And she says, maybe 20 days, maybe no days. We don't get it until we get it. And the sense that, hey, the opportunity to work for 20 days seems like your panacea. When we're wondering about the acuteness, the severity of the depression, the joy of the prospect of being able to work for 20 days is a vision of paradise. That's
I can imagine California must have seemed like a Garden of Eden or something, paradise. If you could just get there, you'd be working. It's a hospitable environment. There was no Dust Bowl there.
And that's the image that's presented to migrating folk from the southern plains. There are handbills that are distributed to ensure that we have a large population there, a large supply of labor, and therefore, relatively low pay for that labor force. So handbills are distributed. They paint California as a paradise. The stories have been circulating from better times. I mean, bear in mind the 1920s is an era of tremendous migration from the Midwest to California, and they have meetings on the beach in Santa Monica of migrants from different parts of the Midwest, and for the state of Iowa, they actually have meetings set up by county. There are so many people from different counties, so there's massive in-migration in the 1920s, massive growth in Southern California. Those images are very, very strong when the Depression begins, and there is labor. Now, some of that labor is, it's all seasonal. So people are leaving and sometimes are staying in California because they can't get back. But there is a significant segment of the Oklahoma migratory farm labor population that is actually traveling to California seasonally and then returning to Oklahoma when it's no longer picking season.
You mentioned John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, 1939?
1939.
Could you talk about that for a moment, the phenomenon? Because I think what a lot of people in the country know of the Depression and the Dust Bowl comes from that book, if they don't have other sources. And people in Oklahoma tend to have very strong feelings. Oh, I love that book, or I hate that book.
They do, yeah.
What was the phenomenon?
Right. So The Grapes of Wrath was a phenomenon. I mean, that's a good place to begin. It's published in April 1939, and by the fall of 1939, the book is in its 9th or 10th printing. It's an incredibly successful book, and by less than a year after the release of the novel, the film is released, March 1940. The film is incredibly popular too. Mm-hmm. What the novel does is take a single family's experience and universalize it to capture the experience of Southern Plains migration more broadly, and it builds up the promise of California, just as we've spoken about this promise of a Garden of Eden for people who want to find labor. Not just labor, I mean, people want to find the promise that George and Lenny were seeking in Of Mice and Men, right? The idea that they could have a place of their own. There was this sense that maybe that was possible. That wasn't possible. California had become a land of corporatized agriculture by the beginning of the 20th century. But this hope that maybe people could find a place of their own. Many of the people who leave are folks who've failed. Maybe that's not the best term. Maybe the system has failed them, but sharecropping, leasing have not worked, and in some cases, there are people who own their own land. But for the most part, it's people who couldn't benefit from government supports as the New Deal was unfolding.
I'm wondering what your assessment would be about the success of the book, the sort of veracity of the book. I've heard stories of public readings of the Grapes of Wrath on the University of Oklahoma campus in the field house, and people argued, no, that's not us, and others said, yes, it is. Right. What did Steinbeck get right, in your judgment?
Well, Steinbeck said in 1938, when he was writing the novel, I'm trying to write history while it is happening, and I don't want it to be wrong. I don't want to get it wrong. He was determined that the portrait he painted of the plight of migrant workers in California would be accurate. It meant a great deal to him, and from the summer of 1936 through the fall of 1938, when he's working on the novel, he's experiencing these circumstances that Oklahoma migrants and Southern Plains migrants are experiencing in California. He's traveling with these groups. He's getting to learn their language, their folkways, their diets, meager as they were. He's learning this in part from employees of the federal government who set up a system of sanitary camps to try and provide some sort of support for migratory workers between picking seasons or between crops. So it's an authentic effort on his part to understand the people he's writing about. But it's an effort that, as you say, has not been terribly well received by all generations of Oklahomans. And I think there are reasons for that. The two basic foundations of the economy in Oklahoma were destroyed in the 1930s, agriculture and oil. And Steinbeck's book painted a picture of a state in crisis, a state that people were leaving. It also painted a picture of people who left as heroes. And there's a moment in the novel where the people who stay behind are symbolized in a character, Muley Graves, who is described as an old graveyard ghost. He can't get real enough to leave this abandoned wasteland of a state. So it's not surprising that people in Oklahoma were upset, particularly leaders of the business world, political leaders. Lyle Boren in the U.S. Congress delivered a speech in which he said that the book was a lie, a damned infernal lie. Steinbeck was lambasted by people in the state of Oklahoma, and in California there were bannings and public burnings of the book. But Eleanor Roosevelt visited the camps and she talked about the truth of the Grapes of Wrath. FDR delivered a radio address in which he mentioned the truths that John Steinbeck had imparted in the novel. And then a federal government commission led by Senator La Follette actually does a deep investigation of the conditions being experienced by migratory farm workers in California and concludes that Steinbeck's portrayal was not just accurate, to some degree, it was not actually capturing the full weight of injustices being committed against these migratory workers.
So many of the segments that we're producing in this series are, well, all of them really, are about marginalized communities, very often people of color. It seems like The Grapes of Wrath is also about a marginalized community. Is there a view, it seems like Steinbeck's always either responding to environment or community. Is there a view of community that you could assess now that maybe has racial overtones or a lack of racial overtones?
Yeah. So, on the one hand, I think Steinbeck should be criticized, and many of the writers of the 30s should be criticized for a failure to break out of the mold of finding heroism in the sort of Jeffersonian agrarian ideal. And that was an ideal that was applied to a white Protestant population. So
basically your proximity to the land, the closer you are, the more ethically probably righteous you are in some way.
Well, there's a powerful scene early in the novel where you have a flashback to Muley Graves sort of refusing to be shunted off the land, and he says, my grandfather killed Indians for us to be able to live on this land. And there's a sense of sort of pride. That's Steinbeck's pen. It's not Steinbeck's voice. Steinbeck's trying to say that people's sense of place came from the land, and their sense of place on the part of white settlers came through the process of displacement of native peoples. So on that level, there are some limitations. I mean, the Joads are quintessential white Protestant heroes.
So if you're an indigenous person or a person of color reading Grapes of Wrath, there might be parts that you would appreciate a lot, but you're largely left out? Would that be accurate to say?
I think so. I mean, I think where race really comes into The Grapes of Wrath is in the treatment of Okies, and Steinbeck uses the term periodically in the novel, their treatment as a sort of racialized other, the dehumanization of the Jodes. At one point, there's a scene as they've come into the state, and one gas station attendant says to another, those Okies are not really human. They're more like animals. They're sexual degenerates. They're like gorillas. And all kinds of dehumanizing stereotypes and racialized stereotypes that were being applied to peoples of color at the time are being applied to the Jodes by white Californians who are not happy about sharing their promised land with these outsiders. So I think the racialization of the Jodes, the racialization of Okies and Southern Plains migrants in general is a pretty powerful cautionary tale. But it's important to point out that there are other writers at the time and artists who do manage to capture the racial richness and complexity in ways that Steinbeck failed to do. And one of the examples that I think is among the most powerful is a Farm Security Administration photographer named Russell Lee, who was inspired by the Grapes of Wrath, as many other writers and artists were. And he decided that he would he would use the Grapes of Wrath as a shooting script. And he would come to Oklahoma and he would take pictures of people in eastern Oklahoma where the novel begins and follow their journey through the state and all the way to California. And it's a remarkable photographic record that shows the richness of Native communities and African American communities in eastern Oklahoma, as well as sort of white Oklahoman poverty. So Russell Lee's photographs from that period, which include these powerful images from the May Avenue camp in Oklahoma City, some of the most disturbing images of poverty from the entire decade. And there was a purpose to these pictures. The head of the historical section of the Farm Security Administration said that when he received photographs from Russell Lee, it helped him deal with this terribly difficult work of documenting the Depression. He said that Russell Lee's pictures said to me, now here's a fellow who needs a little help, and if we can just do a little something, maybe we can make their life better. And there were many, many employees of the federal government who I think were on that same mission. If we can just show the nobility, the decency of the people that we're depicting, then we can generate that support, that empathy among the national population.
Are there other writers you can mention from that period, or maybe in the present now, that you think captures maybe a little more than a broader view, broader lens than Steinbeck had?
Yeah, I think one of my favorite Oklahoma writers who leaves the state, but the state never leaves her, is Sonora Babb. And Sonora Babb she's a remarkable writer who is lost to history in part because of the very success of The Grapes of Wrath. Her novel, Whose Names Are Unknown, was actually taken to Steinbeck's agent, and there just there was a sense that why would you publish another Dust Bowl novel to compete with The Grapes of Wrath? But that's a novel that should have been published in 1940. In the end, it was published in, I think, 2004, 2005 by the University of Oklahoma Press. And it's a remarkable Dust Bowl novel. There's not much on race in that novel, but in another of Babb's works, a memoir called An Owl on Every Post, she writes about the sort of white indigenous mixed world in Oklahoma at the turn of the 20th century that she grew up in, and how wonderfully sort of natural that world seemed to her. Of course, Angie DeBow, one of the most important chroniclers of the injustices committed against Native peoples in this state, Angie DeBow is one of the state's great sort of treasures as a historian of contemporary writers chronicling the racial richness and complexity of Oklahoma one of my favorites is the University of Oklahoma's own Rilla Askew, and a wonderful book, Harp Song.
Could you hold it up?
Yeah, absolutely. So Harp Song is set in the midst of the Great Depression. It's one of the lead characters, Sharon, is reflecting back on her life with Harlan Singer, this remarkable musician character who manages to captivate the populations he comes in touch with. And as you read further and further into the story of Sharon and Harlan trying to stay alive in the first half of the 1930s, you see this richness in the state sort of coming into play periodically. So Harlan is haunted by the death of an African-American kid who he had traveled with, Willie Jones. And that's that haunting scene that gets described towards the end of the novel of a group of white men beating Willie Jones to death. It's a powerful scene, but there's more going on here. Calm Bledsoe is a Native man, a Cherokee man who on occasions sort of saves Sharon and Harlan, helps sort of literally bring them back to life. And then at the end of the novel, we realize that Harlan is probably of mixed racial heritage himself, and we're not sure. Is he Native American? Is he part African American? But there's a wonderfully rich racial landscape painted there, including in the May Avenue camps. Right there are scenes of people desperate, camped along the river in Oklahoma City, and it's not just the white camp that's been depicted in some of the chronicles of the Great Depression, but an African-American community camped there as well. So I think this is Harp Song is a wonderful window into the racial richness and complexity and diversity of Oklahoma during the 30s.
That's a great note to end on. David Wrobel, thank you so much for giving us a sense of the history for part of the state and the trauma that the state's experienced after the Dust Bowl and during that period. Thank you very much.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
Thank you for being with us today, and I hope you catch more segments of Understanding Oklahoma. You take care.